Welcome! You have made it here to this quiet space at the end of your day. Let yourself settle. Let the weight of the hours behind you ease away little by little. Tonight we're going to follow a story that stretches across centuries and continents. It is the story of how people survived winter when there were no trees to build with, no coal to burn, and no option but to turn to the earth itself for shelter. In the American West, beyond a line geographers called the 100th meridian, the prairie stretched without end. In medieval Europe, across the cold latitudes of the north, peasants faced similar scarcity. In both places, families dug into the ground. They carved homes from hillsides. They slept beneath tons of soil and grass, warmed by the planet's own memory of summer. This is not a tale of adventure or triumph. It is simply the story of how human beings rested through the coldest nights in history, using what the land provided and what their hands could shape. It is a story of routine, of small decisions repeated across generations, of warmth measured not in degrees but in survival. So settle in. Let the story unfold at its own pace. We begin on the open plain, where the horizon holds no shadow of a tree. The Great Plains of North America were not always a destination. For much of the 19th century they were a barrier to cross on the way to somewhere else. Maps labelled them the Great American Desert. Travellers moved through quickly, their wagons aimed at Oregon or California, their eyes fixed on mountain ranges in the distance. But in 1862, the United States government passed the Homestead Act. It offered 160 acres of public land to any citizen willing to live on it, and improve it for 5 years. The terms were simple, the challenge was not. The line that changed everything was the 100th meridian. It runs roughly through the middle of the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma and Texas. East of that line, annual rainfall averaged 30 inches or more. Forests grew, timber was abundant. West of it, rainfall dropped to 20 inches or less. The land became prairie, grass stretched to the horizon, unbroken by trees. Settlers who claimed land west of the 100th meridian found themselves in a landscape that defied the building traditions they'd carried from the east. There were no oak groves to harvest, no pine forests within walking distance. The few trees that existed, cottonwoods along creek beds, scattered willows, were jealously guarded or already claimed. Lumber had to be hauled in by wagon or later by rail. Soft pine from Minnesota travelled hundreds of miles to reach the plains. The cost was prohibitive. A single load of lumber might consume a family's entire savings. For most homesteaders, a wood frame house was not an option for the first year, or the second, or sometimes ever. The prairie itself offered only two materials in abundance: soil and grass. The soil was dense, rich in organic matter, bound together by root, systems that had grown undisturbed for thousands of years. The grass was tough, wiry, resistant to drought. Together they formed a structural material that settlers learned to cut, stack, and live within. But before that learning came, there was the first winter. And the first winter required immediate shelter. The solution was the dugout. It was not a new idea. Across history, across continents, humans had turned to the earth when other materials failed them. In northern Europe during the early Middle Ages, peasants dug similar structures called Grubenhäuser. In the Ice Age, hunter-gatherers on the Ukrainian steppe built shelters from mammoth bones and soil. The principle was always the same. When you cannot build above the ground, you build within it. A dugout began with a hillside. Ideally, the slope faced east or south. This orientation mattered. A south-facing entrance caught the low winter sun, providing a few hours of direct light and warmth. An east-facing entrance allowed morning light to penetrate the interior. Both orientations placed the back of the structure toward the north, shielding it from the prevailing winds that swept across the plains with nothing to slow them. The settler, often a single man, sometimes a young couple, would choose a site and begin digging. The tool was a spade. The method was straightforward. A rectangular hole was carved into the slope, usually 10 feet square for a first dwelling. The excavation went back into the hill, creating 3 walls of packed earth. Only the front wall needed to be built. The floor was smoothed and tamped down. In many cases it was sloped slightly toward the entrance to allow water to drain out rather than pooling inside. Groundwater and rain seepage were constant concerns. A flat floor could become a muddy basin. A sloped floor, even a subtle one, kept the interior marginally drier. The front wall was assembled from whatever materials were at hand. If the settler had brought a few logs, they might frame a simple wall with a door and a small window. More often, the wall was built from sod blocks, rectangles of prairie turf cut with a specialised plough and stacked like bricks. These blocks were heavy, roughly 50 pounds each, and bound together by the root systems of the grasses. Laid grass side down, they interlocked. Laid in staggered rows, they formed a wall that could bear weight. The roof was the most critical and the most dangerous part of the structure. It had to span the width of the dugout, support its own considerable weight, and insulate the interior from temperature extremes. The standard method involved laying log beams across the gap from the hillside to the top of the front wall. These beams were often cottonwood or willow, scavenged from stream beds. If no logs were available, settlers used whatever timber they could afford to haul in. Across the beams, a layer of smaller branches, saplings or brush was laid. This formed a rough framework. On top of that, grass, weeds or old burlap sacks were spread to create a barrier. Finally, a thick layer of soil and sod was added. The finished roof could weigh 3 tons or more. This mass was not incidental. It was insulation. It was thermal stability. It was the reason a dugout could maintain a livable interior temperature when the air outside dropped below zero. But it was also a liability. A heavy rain could soak the sod, doubling its weight. Roofs sagged. Beams cracked. Collapses were common enough that settlers learned to recognise the warning signs. A new gap between the roof and the wall, a creak that hadn't been there before, a subtle downward curve in the ceiling line. There were other hazards. Livestock occasionally grazed on the roof, unaware that it was not solid ground. A cow or horse stepping through the ceiling was a disaster that appears in multiple frontier accounts. Snakes, seeking warmth or shelter, burrowed into the sod and occasionally dropped through gaps onto the floor below. Spiders and rodents infested the organic materials. Dirt fell constantly, especially during high winds, sifting down through cracks like a fine, gritty rain. Despite these difficulties, the dugout served its purpose. It provided shelter from the wind, which was often more lethal than the cold itself. It moderated temperature swings through the thermal mass of the surrounding earth, and it could be built in a matter of days with minimal resources. Settlers called it temporary. They spoke of it as a stopping point, a place to endure the first year or two until they could afford something better. But for many families, the dugout became home for 5 years, 10 years, sometimes longer. It was where children were born, where illnesses were weathered, where the long plains winters were survived. And it was where they learned, through necessity, to sleep underground. The work of digging began in late spring or early summer, when the ground had thawed and dried enough to be workable. Timing mattered. A homesteader who arrived too late in the season risked facing winter in a tent or a wagon, shelters that offered almost no protection against plains cold. The first task was site selection. This was not arbitrary. The hill had to be high enough to provide drainage, but not so steep that the excavation would collapse. The soil had to be stable. Loose or sandy earth would not hold a vertical wall. Clay-rich soil was ideal, cohesive and resistant to erosion. The slope's orientation determined how much light the interior would receive and how much wind it would block. A north-facing dugout was colder and darker. A west-facing dugout caught afternoon sun but also bore the brunt of the prevailing winds. East and south were the preferred choices, balancing light, warmth and wind protection. Once the site was chosen, the dimensions were marked. 10 feet by 10 feet was common for a single person or a young couple. Larger families might excavate 12 by 14 feet, though this increased the difficulty of roofing. The larger the span, the stronger the beams needed to be. Excavation was done by hand. A spade cut through the sod and into the soil beneath. The first few inches were dense with grass roots, tangled and resistant. Below that, the soil was easier to move but still heavy. A single cubic foot of Great Plains soil, moist and compacted, could weigh 100 pounds. Removing enough earth to create a 10 by 10 room meant shifting tons of material. The excavated soil was piled near the entrance or spread around the site. Some of it would be used later for the roof. The rest became part of the landscape, gradually eroding back into the hill. As the hole deepened, the walls were shaped. They had to be as vertical as possible to maximise interior space, but they also had to be stable. A wall cut too steeply would slough and crumble. Settlers learned to angle the walls slightly, leaning them back into the hill for support. The back wall and side, walls were left as bare earth. No framing was added, no reinforcement. The soil itself was the structure. This worked because the ground was not hollow. It was continuous, part of the hill, supported by the mass of the earth behind and around it. The front wall was different. It was the boundary between the interior and the exterior, and it had to be built. If the settler had access to logs, they might construct a simple frame. Vertical posts set into the ground, horizontal beams connecting them, and planks or split logs filling the gaps. A door was cut into the frame, often just a rough opening covered by a blanket or a piece of canvas. More commonly, the front wall was built from sod. The blocks were cut from the surrounding prairie using a breaking plough, a heavy tool pulled by oxen or horses. The plough sliced through the sod in long strips, which were then chopped into manageable sections. Each block was approximately 2 feet long, 1 foot wide and 4 inches thick. The blocks were stacked with the grass side facing down, so the roots interlocked with the layer below. This created a self-binding structure. No mortar was used. The weight of the upper layers compressed the lower ones, and the roots gradually knit together, forming a cohesive mass. The wall rose slowly. Each layer added 4 inches of height. A wall 6 feet tall required 18 layers. The work was repetitive and physically demanding. Sod blocks were awkward to handle, heavy and floppy, prone to breaking apart if mishandled. As the wall reached its full height, a gap was left for the door and, if possible, a small window. Window frames were made from scavenged wood, or purchased at great expense. The frames were set loosely into the wall, not fixed rigidly. This allowed the wall to settle without crushing the wood or breaking the glass. Settling was inevitable. Sod is organic. It dries. It compresses. Over the first year, a newly built sod wall could settle several inches. To accommodate this, settlers left a gap above door and window frames and stuffed it with rags or loose grass. As the wall settled, the gap closed. The rags could be removed once the structure had stabilised. The floor of the dugout was usually left as packed earth. Smoothing it was a matter of scraping and tamping, using the back of a shovel or a flat stone. Some families spread straw or hay over the floor to reduce dust and provide a softer surface. Others, if they could afford it, laid down wooden planks or pieced together a rough floor from scrap lumber. The floor was sloped toward the entrance, usually by just a few degrees. This ensured that any water entering the dugout, whether from rain, snowmelt or condensation, would flow out rather than accumulating inside. Even a shallow pool of standing water could freeze in winter, creating a hazardous and uncomfortable living space. With the walls and floor complete, the final task was the roof. This required beams strong enough to span the width of the dugout and support the weight of the soil that would be piled on top. Cottonwood logs were the most common choice, scavenged from creek beds or purchased from a lumberyard. If logs were unavailable, settlers improvised with whatever they could find. Thick branches lashed together, salvaged railroad ties, even old wagon parts. The beams were laid across the dugout, resting on the front wall and on the back edge of the excavation. They were spaced roughly 2 feet apart. The gaps between them were filled with a lattice of smaller branches, willow brush, or split saplings. This created a rough platform. On top of the lattice, a layer of grass or weeds was spread. This acted as a barrier to prevent the soil above from sifting down through the gaps. Some settlers used old burlap sacks or pieces of canvas if they had them. The goal was to create a continuous surface that would support the weight of the earth. Finally, the soil was added. It was piled on by the shovelful, gradually building up a layer 1 to 2 feet thick. On top of the soil, strips of sod were laid, grass side up. These strips formed a living roof, their roots binding the soil together and preventing erosion. The finished roof was massive. It was also effective. The thick layer of earth provided insulation far superior to anything that could be achieved with wood alone. It dampened temperature swings, keeping the interior cool in summer and warm in winter. And it was nearly fireproof, a significant advantage on a prairie where wildfires were a constant threat. But the roof was not without its problems. It was heavy. The beams beneath it were under constant strain. If a beam cracked or shifted, the entire roof could sag or collapse. Rain added weight. A soaking rain could double the mass of the roof, pushing the supporting structure to its limit. Maintenance was ongoing. Cracks had to be filled, gaps had to be patched. After a heavy snow, the roof had to be shoveled to prevent overload. Settlers learned to listen to their roofs, to notice the small creaks and shifts that signalled a problem developing. Despite the effort, despite the hazards, the dugout was functional. It was a structure born of necessity, shaped by scarcity, and refined through trial and error. It was not comfortable, it was not beautiful, but it was shelter. And on the open prairie, in the middle of winter, shelter was survival. The roof of a dugout was not simply a covering. It was a thermal system, a structural challenge, and a living ecosystem all at once. Understanding its function requires understanding the forces it balanced and the materials it held. 3 tons of soil and sod resting on a framework of logs and brush created a yali that was both essential and dangerous. The weight compressed the structure, forcing beams to bear loads they were barely adequate to support. But that same weight provided the thermal mass necessary to moderate the interior climate. Thermal mass is the capacity of a material to absorb and store heat energy. Dense materials like soil, stone, and water have high thermal mass. They heat up slowly and cool down slowly. This creates a damping effect on temperature fluctuations. In a dugout, the thick earthen roof absorbed heat during the day, whether from sunlight striking the surface or from the warmth of a fire inside the dwelling. At night, as the air temperature dropped, the roof released that stored heat back into the interior. The result was a much smaller temperature swing than would occur in a structure with thin walls and a light roof. This effect was amplified by the specific heat capacity of soil. Soil can absorb a significant amount of energy before its temperature changes noticeably. A cubic metre of dry soil has a heat capacity roughly equal to a cubic metre of water. When moist, its capacity is even higher. The roof was not the only source of thermal mass. The 3 earthen walls of the dugout contributed as well. Together they created an envelope that surrounded the living space with material that resisted rapid temperature change. But the roof was the most critical component because it was the boundary between the heated interior and the cold exterior air. In a conventional above-ground house with a wooden roof, that boundary was a few inches of wood and perhaps some thatch. In a dugout, it was 2 feet of soil. The difference in insulation value was substantial. Insulation works by reducing the rate of heat transfer. Materials with low thermal conductivity slow the movement of heat from a warm area to a cold area. Soil is a moderately good insulator, though not as effective as materials like wool or down. Its insulating value depends on its moisture content and density. Dry, loose soil insulates better than wet, compacted soil. The sod layer on top of the roof contributed both insulation and structural integrity. The grass roots held the soil together, preventing erosion. The living plants, if they continued to grow, absorbed moisture and provided additional thermal regulation. However, the organic nature of the roof created problems. Grass and soil attract life. Insects burrowed into the thatch. Rodents made nests in the softer layers. Snakes, seeking warmth or prey, wound their way through gaps in the structure. Settlers frequently reported snakes dropping from the ceiling, especially during the transition between seasons when the reptiles were moving between hibernation sites and hunting grounds. Rattlesnakes were particularly common on the plains. A snake falling onto a bed or into a cooking pot was not just startling, it was potentially deadly. To mitigate this, many families hung sheets of muslin or canvas from the ceiling, creating a false barrier between the roof and the living space. These fabric ceilings caught falling dirt, insects, and occasionally snakes. They also reflected lamplight, making the dark interior marginally brighter. The dirt that fell was constant. Even in calm weather, fine particles sifted down through cracks. During windstorms, the vibration of the roof structure dislodged larger clumps. Settlers described the interior of a dugout during a high wind as being filled with a haze of dust. the air gritty and hard to breathe. Rain presented a different challenge. When the roof became saturated, it gained weight rapidly. Water filled the pores in the soil, increasing its density. A dry sod roof might weigh 3 tons. A wet one could weigh 5 or 6. The supporting beams, already under strain, had to bear this additional load. If the beams were marginal to begin with, undersized or weakened by rot, the added weight could cause them to crack. A cracking beam made a distinctive sound, a sharp report like a gunshot. Settlers learned to recognize it and to evacuate immediately. Roof collapses were common enough to be mentioned in numerous accounts. The collapse might be sudden and total, or it might be gradual, the roof sagging, over hours or days until it finally gave way. In either case, the result was catastrophic. The family lost their shelter. Their possessions were buried under tons of mud and debris. If anyone was inside at the time, they could be injured or killed. To prevent collapse, settlers inspected their roofs regularly. They looked for signs of sagging, for cracks in the beams, for gaps opening between the roof and the walls. Repairs were made as soon as problems were detected. Additional support posts were sometimes installed inside the dugout to reduce the span the beams had to carry. Even with careful maintenance, the roof remained a hazard. Livestock grazing on the hillside occasionally stepped through, their hooves breaking through the sod and plunging into the interior. This was more likely if the roof was old and the sod had thinned, or if the soil had been eroded by wind and rain. Accounts describe startled cows crashing partway through a roof, their legs dangling into the room below, bellowing in panic while the family scrambled to calm the animal and extract it without causing further damage. Despite these risks, the earthen roof was irreplaceable. No other material available to frontier settlers provided equivalent insulation. Wood alone would not have kept the interior warm enough to survive a plains winter. Canvas or hides were even less effective. The dugout's roof was a compromise. It was heavy, hazardous, prone to leaks and infestations. But it was also the reason a family could sleep through a night when the temperature outside dropped to 20 below zero and the wind howled across the prairie with nothing to stop it. The roof was survival, measured in tons. As settlers established their farms and gained access to resources, the temporary dugout often gave way to a more permanent structure, the sod house. Unlike the dugout, which was partially excavated into a hillside, the sod house was freestanding, built entirely above ground from blocks cut from the prairie itself. The transition from dugout to sod house represented an increase in labour, materials, and ambition. It also represented a commitment to permanence. A dugout could be abandoned with little loss. A sod house required weeks of work and hundreds of sod blocks. It was not built lightly. The first step was selecting the right sod. Not all prairie grass produced suitable building material. The best sod came from areas where native grasses, buffalo grass, little bluestem, wiregrass, had grown undisturbed for years. These grasses developed root systems that were dense, tough, and deeply interwoven. The roots were the key. They acted as a binding agent, holding the soil together and giving the sod block structural integrity. Without strong roots, a block would crumble when handled. With them, it could be cut, lifted, stacked, and mortared into a wall that would last for decades. Cutting sod required specialized equipment. The most common tool was a breaking plough, also called a grasshopper plough. This was a heavy plough with a wide, flat blade designed to cut horizontally through the sod at a depth of about 4 inches. It was pulled by a team of oxen or horses. The plough sliced the sod into long ribbons, typically 12 to 18 inches wide. These ribbons were then chopped into blocks, usually 2 feet long. Each block weighed approximately 50 pounds. A single acre of prairie could yield several thousand blocks, more than enough to build a modest house. The cutting was done in late spring or early summer, after the grass had greened but before it had gone to seed. The sod had to be moist enough to hold together but not so wet that it became muddy and unmanageable. Timing was critical. If the sod dried out too much, the roots would weaken and the blocks would fall apart. Once cut, the blocks were stacked near the building site to dry slightly. They needed to lose some moisture to become lighter and easier to handle, but not so much that they became brittle. A few days of drying was usually sufficient. The construction of a sod house began with site selection. Unlike a dugout, which required a hillside, a sod house needed level ground. The site was cleared of grass and debris, and the dimensions of the house were marked out. A typical sod house was 14 feet by 16 feet, though sizes varied depending on the family's needs and resources. The first course of sod blocks was laid directly on the ground. Some builders dug a shallow trench and filled it with stones to create a rudimentary foundation, but this was not always necessary. The weight of the sod walls, eventually reaching several tons, provided stability on its own. The blocks were laid grass side down with the roots facing into the wall. This orientation allowed the roots from adjacent blocks to interlock as they dried, creating a cohesive structure. The blocks were staggered, like bricks, so that the joints in one course did not align with the joints in the course above or below. This staggering distributed the load and prevented vertical cracks from forming. The walls were built thick. 2 blocks per course was common, giving a wall thickness of about 24 inches. Some builders used 3 blocks, creating walls up to 36 inches thick. This thickness provided exceptional insulation and structural strength. As the walls rose, the blocks were occasionally moistened to keep them pliable and to encourage the roots to continue growing. In some cases, the grass on the blocks would sprout and grow, creating a living wall that required periodic trimming. This was more common in the early weeks after construction, before the sod fully dried and the grass died back. Gaps between blocks were filled with loose soil or clay. This chinking sealed the wall against drafts and insects. It also helped bind the blocks together, creating a more unified structure. The most challenging part of sod house construction was incorporating openings for doors and windows. Each opening required a frame to support the weight of the sod above it. These frames were made from wood, usually rough-cut lumber or logs. The frames were not set rigidly into the wall. Instead, they were placed loosely with a gap left above them. This gap was stuffed with rags, grass, or other compressible material. As the sod dried and the walls settled, sometimes by as much as 6 inches, the gap allowed the frame to remain intact without being crushed. Settling was a slow process. It took months, sometimes a full year, for a sod house to reach its final dimensions. During this time, the structure had to be monitored. Cracks that appeared were filled. Frames that began to shift were adjusted. The house was a living thing, compressing and stabilising under its own weight. The roof of a sod house was similar to that of a dugout, but more complex because it had to span a greater distance and support itself without the hillside for backing. Wooden beams, often cottonwood or pine, were laid across the width of the house. These beams were supported by the front and back walls, and in larger houses by 1 or more interior posts. On top of the beams, a framework of smaller branches or boards created a platform. This was covered with grass, canvas or tar paper, and then topped with a thick layer of sod. The finished roof could weigh as much as the walls, a massive load that required strong beams and careful engineering. Despite their weight, sod roofs were prone to leaks. Water would seep through cracks or saturate the sod and drip into the interior. During heavy rains, the inside of a sod house could be as wet as the outside, with families draping tarps over furniture and beds to keep them dry. After the rain stopped, the roof would take days to dry. The trapped moisture created a humid, uncomfortable environment. Mould grew on fabric and wood. The smell of damp earth was constant. To mitigate these problems, some builders added a second roof above the sod, creating an air gap for ventilation. Others plastered the interior ceiling with clay or lime to seal it against drips. Neither solution was perfect, but both helped reduce the worst of the dampness. The interior walls of a sod house were often finished to make the space more livable. Clay plaster was a common choice. It was made from local soil mixed with water and sometimes straw or animal hair for binding. The plaster was applied directly to the sod, creating a smooth, hard surface that reflected lamplight and sealed out insects. Another option was to cover the walls with fabric or wallpaper. This required a framework of wooden strips attached to the sod, onto which the fabric could be tacked. Flour sacks, muslin and newspaper were all used. The effect was to make the interior feel less like a cave and more like a conventional room. The floor of a sod house was usually packed earth, similar to a dugout. Families who could afford it installed wooden floors, but this was a luxury. More often, the floor was covered with rugs or straw to reduce dust and provide insulation from the cold ground. Despite its challenges, the sod house was a significant improvement over the dugout. It was brighter, with larger windows and sometimes multiple rooms. It was drier, with better drainage and ventilation. And it was a symbol of progress, a sign that the family was establishing itself and moving beyond mere survival. But it was still a house made of dirt. It still harboured pests. It still required constant maintenance. And it still depended on the same principle that made the dugout viable, the earth itself as insulation, as structure, as ally against the cold. The survival of families in earth-sheltered dwellings was not a matter of luck or endurance alone. It was a matter of physics. The properties of soil, its density, its heat capacity, its thermal conductivity, created an environment that moderated temperature extremes and reduced the amount of fuel needed to maintain livable conditions. To understand how this worked, it is necessary to understand how heat moves through materials and how the earth behaves as a thermal system. Heat transfer occurs in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. In the context of a sod house or dugout, conduction was the dominant mechanism. Heat moved from the warm interior through the walls and roof to the cold exterior by direct contact between molecules. The rate of this heat transfer depends on the thermal conductivity of the material. Materials with high thermal conductivity, like metal, transfer heat quickly. Materials with low thermal conductivity, like wool or air, transfer heat slowly. Soil has moderate thermal conductivity. It is not as insulating as air or fibre, but it is far better than wood or stone. The exact value depends on the soil's composition, moisture content and density. Dry, loose soil is a better insulator than wet, compacted soil. Sandy soil conducts heat more readily than clay-rich soil. For the settlers on the Great Plains, the soil was typically a dense, organic, rich mixture called mollisol. This soil had good structural properties and moderate insulating value. More importantly, it had high thermal mass. Thermal mass is the ability of a material to absorb and store thermal energy. It is determined by the material's specific heat capacity and its density. Specific heat capacity is the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of a given mass of material by 1 degree. Soil has a relatively high specific heat capacity, especially when moist. This means it can absorb a lot of energy without its temperature changing much. When combined with the large volume of earth in a sod wall, often several cubic meters per wall, the total thermal mass was enormous. This thermal mass acted as a buffer against temperature fluctuations. During the day, when the interior of the house was warmed by sunlight or a fire, the walls absorbed some of that heat. At night, when the fire burned low and the air temperature dropped, the walls released the stored heat back into the room. The effect was to smooth out the peaks and valleys of the daily temperature cycle. Instead of the interior temperature swinging wildly from warm to cold, it remained relatively stable. This stability was critical for survival. A stable temperature meant less fuel was needed to maintain comfort. It also meant less risk of freezing during the coldest hours before dawn. The second critical concept is thermal lag. This is the time delay between a change in surface temperature and a change in temperature at depth. Heat moves through soil slowly. A hot day warms the surface quickly, but it takes weeks for that warmth to penetrate several feet down. Similarly, a cold night chills the surface, but the deeper layers remain warm. At a depth of about 5 feet, the ground temperature in most temperate regions remains nearly constant throughout the year. It lags the surface temperature by approximately 3 months. In the summer, when the air is hot, the deep soil is still cool from winter. In the winter, when the air is freezing, the deep soil is still warm from summer. This lag creates a natural temperature reservoir. A dugout built into a hillside is surrounded on 3 sides by earth that is not at the current air temperature, but at the temperature of the season 3 months prior. In practical terms, this meant that in January, when the air temperature on the Great Plains might drop to 0 or below, the soil 5 feet down was still at 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The walls of the dugout were not fighting against a 0-degree exterior, they were backed by a 55-degree mass. The temperature gradient, the difference the heating system had to overcome, was much smaller. Instead of raising the interior from 0 to 60 degrees, the stove only had to raise it from 55 to 60. This drastically reduced fuel consumption. The roof, being above ground, did not benefit from the thermal lag in the same way. The soil on the roof was exposed to the air and would eventually equilibrate with the ambient temperature, but the sheer mass of the roof still provided damping. The 2-foot-thick sod roof would not heat or cool as quickly as a thin wooden roof. It absorbed the day's warmth and released it slowly overnight. The combination of thermal mass and thermal lag created a dwelling that was thermally stable. The interior temperature did not track the exterior temperature hour by hour. It averaged it out, responding slowly to changes and maintaining a baseline warmth that made survival possible. This was not a theoretical advantage. Settlers experienced it directly. Multiple accounts describe dugouts and sod houses as being naturally cool in summer and warm in winter. The same structure that kept them from overheating in July kept them from freezing in January. However, this thermal stability came with a trade-off. The thick walls and roof made the interior dark. Light entered only through small windows and the open door. On overcast winter days, the interior could be so dim that it was difficult to see across the room. Lamps helped, but lamp oil was expensive. Many families rationed their use of lamps, burning them only when absolutely necessary. The rest of the time, they lived in a twilight gloom, their eyes adjusting to the low light. The darkness had psychological effects. Settlers spoke of feeling enclosed, buried, cut off from the outside world. The lack of visual stimulation, combined with the isolation of the plains, contributed to a sense of confinement that some found difficult to bear. But the darkness was also associated with rest. The dim interior encouraged sleep. There was little to do after sunset except tend the fire, eat, and go to bed. The rhythms of life aligned with the rhythms of light and dark, unmediated by artificial illumination. The earth sheltered. Dwelling was, in essence, a passive thermal system. It required no complex machinery, no external energy source beyond the small fire in the stove. It worked because the builders understood, whether consciously or intuitively, how to leverage the physical properties of the materials around them. The same principles that kept a dugout warm in winter kept a root cellar cool in summer. The same thermal mass that moderated daily temperature swings also moderated seasonal swings. The ground beneath the prairie was not just a foundation. It was an active participant in the survival of the people who built their lives within it. This was not unique to the American frontier. Medieval Grubenhäuser operated on the same principles. So did the pit houses of the Ice Age. Across time and geography, humans have returned to the Earth when other options failed, and the Earth, with its slow, patient thermal rhythms, has provided. Centuries before settlers carved dugouts into the American prairie, peasants in northern Europe were digging similar structures into chalk and clay. These were called Grubenhäuser, a German term meaning pit houses. In English archaeological literature, they are sometimes called sunken featured buildings, abbreviated as SFBs. They appeared across a wide geographic range. Sites have been excavated in England, Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark and Poland. The time span is equally broad, from the 5th century through the 12th. For roughly 700 years, the Grubenhaus was a common feature of the rural landscape in northern Europe. The basic design was consistent. A rectangular pit was dug into the ground, typically between 0.5 metre and 1 metre deep. The pit measured roughly 3 metres by 4 metres, though sizes varied. At either end of the long axis, post holes were dug to support upright wooden posts. These posts carried a ridged roof, usually thatched with straw or reeds. The function of the pit itself has been debated by archaeologists. Some structures show evidence of a suspended wooden floor built over the pit, creating an air gap beneath the living surface. This gap could have been used for storage, particularly of items that benefited from cool, stable temperatures. Root vegetables, preserved meats, and ceramic jars of grain could be kept in the space below, protected from rodents and temperature extremes. Other Grubenhäuser show no evidence of a suspended floor. Instead, the floor of the pit was the working surface. Hearths and ovens have been found sitting directly on the base of these pits, indicating that the sunken space was actively used as living or working area, not merely as a cellar. The reasons for this variation are not fully understood. It may have been a matter of regional tradition. it may have been related to the specific use of the building. Or it may simply have been a practical response to local soil conditions and available materials. What is clear from the archaeological record is that many Grubenhäuser were not primarily dwellings, they were workshops. The evidence for this comes from the artifacts found within them. Loom weights are common, indicating weaving. Spindle whorls suggest textile preparation. Fragments of worked bone and antler point to craft production. Weaving, in particular, seems to have been closely associated with these structures. The medieval economy depended heavily on textile production. Flax and wool were spun into thread and woven into cloth in nearly every household. The work was labour-intensive and required specific environmental conditions. Thread is fragile. If the air is too dry, fibres become brittle and break during weaving. If it is too humid, they become slack and difficult to tension properly. The ideal environment for weaving is cool and slightly humid, with minimal fluctuation. A Grubenhaus provided this environment. The earth-sheltered walls moderated temperature. The pit itself, being below ground, remained cooler in summer and warmer in winter than an above-ground room. The soil maintained a consistent level of moisture, preventing the extreme dryness that could occur in a heated above-ground space during winter. This made the Grubenhaus particularly valuable during the cold months. While an above-ground hall might be heated with a large central fire, the air near the fire would be hot and dry, while the air away from it would be cold. The temperature gradient was steep. The humidity was uncontrolled. In contrast, the Grubenhaus could be heated with a small fire, or even left unheated, relying on the thermal stability of the earth to keep the interior at a workable temperature. The weaver could sit in relative comfort, producing cloth without the risk of snapping threads or the discomfort of extreme cold. The Grubenhaus was not always a separate structure. In some settlements, these buildings were integrated into the farmstead, alongside larger above-ground halls. The hall served as the primary dwelling, where the family ate, socialised, and slept near the central hearth. The Grubenhaus served as a specialised workspace, used during the day or for specific tasks. This division of function is supported by archaeological evidence from sites like West Stow in England. Excavations there revealed a settlement pattern of large halls accompanied by several smaller Grubenhäuser. The halls had evidence of domestic activity, cooking, eating, sleeping. The Grubenhäuser had evidence of craft production and storage. However, not all Grubenhäuser fit this pattern. Some appear to have been standalone dwellings, particularly in poorer or more marginal settlements. For families who could not afford to build a large timber hall, a Grubenhaus offered a viable alternative. It required less wood, less labour, and less skill to construct. And it provided adequate shelter. The construction process was straightforward. The pit was excavated by hand using wooden spades or iron tools if available. The soil was removed and piled nearby. The post holes were dug at each end, deep enough to hold the posts securely upright. The posts themselves were substantial timbers, often oak or other durable hardwoods. They were set into the post holes and packed with stones and earth to hold them in place. The posts supported the ridge beam, which ran the length of the building at the peak of the roof. The roof was framed with lighter timbers leaning from the ridge beam down to the ground. This created a simple gable shape. The frame was then covered with thatch, layers of straw or reeds bundled and tied in place. The thatch shed water and provided insulation. The walls, if they existed at all, were often minimal. Some Grubenhäuser had wattle and daub walls filling the gap between the edge of the roof and the ground. Others had no walls, the roof extending all the way to the surface. The pit itself served as the lower portion of the structure. Entrance was typically through a door at one gabled end. The door opened directly into the pit, requiring a step down from ground level. This step down was both a practical feature and a psychological threshold, marking the transition from the exterior world to the sheltered interior. Inside, the space was dim. Light entered through the door and in some cases through small openings in the gable ends. There were no windows in the modern sense. The interior was shadowed, the air still and cool. The floor, whether suspended or at the base of the pit, was usually packed earth or clay. Some structures had wooden planks laid over the dirt to create a cleaner surface. Others left the earth bare, sweeping it regularly to maintain cleanliness. Heating was minimal. A small hearth or brazier might be used for warmth or light, but the structure did not require the constant large fires needed in above-ground buildings. The earth itself provided enough thermal stability to make the space habitable without intensive heating. This efficiency was critical in a medieval economy, where fuel was a valuable resource. Wood had to be cut, transported and stored. Peat, where available, required harvesting and drying. Any reduction in fuel consumption freed up labour and resources for other tasks. The Grubenhaus, like the American dugout, was a response to environmental and economic pressures. It was a way to create functional space with minimal input of scarce materials. And it worked because it aligned with the physics of the Earth, using thermal mass and below-ground placement to create a stable, usable environment. By the 12th century, the Grubenhaus began to decline in prevalence. Changes in agricultural practices, improvements in timber framing techniques, and shifts in settlement patterns all contributed to its gradual abandonment. Above-ground structures became more common, even among the lower classes. But the knowledge embedded in the Grubenhaus did not disappear entirely. The principle of earth sheltering persisted in other forms: root cellars, ice houses, storage pits. And in regions where resources remained scarce, people continued to dig into the ground, finding in the soil a reliable partner against the cold. The American Great Plains in the mid-19th century presented a problem that could not be solved by imported solutions. The absence of trees meant the absence of firewood. Coal was available in some areas, but it had to be hauled by wagon from distant railheads, and the cost was prohibitive for most homesteaders. The solution came from the landscape itself, specifically from the animals that grazed on it. Before their near extinction in the 1880s, American bison numbered in the tens of millions. They moved across the prairie in vast herds, grazing on the native grasses, and they left behind an abundant byproduct: dung. Bison dung, when dried, became a fuel source. Settlers called it buffalo chips, or sometimes bois, de vache, a French term meaning wood of the cow. The name was not entirely ironic. Dried buffalo chips burned with a steady heat, produced little smoke, and were odourless. In many respects, they performed as well as wood. The key to their utility was their composition. Bison are herbivores, consuming only grass and other plant material. Their digestive systems break down cellulose, but much of the plant fibre passes through undigested. When the dung dries, these fibres form a compact combustible mass. The drying process took several weeks. Fresh dung was wet and would not burn. It had to be left in the sun, exposed to wind and heat, until all moisture had evaporated. The prairie climate was ideal for this. Hot summers and low humidity meant that chips dried quickly and completely. Dried chips were light and easy to handle. They had a papery texture and broke apart easily. Children could gather them without difficulty. Women, initially reluctant to touch animal waste, quickly adapted. One account describes the transition from dainty thumb and forefinger, handling to confidently stoking a stove with one hand while stirring biscuit dough with the other. Not all chips were equal. Settlers developed a detailed understanding of chip quality based on the animal's diet and the season. Chips from cattle grazing on mature buffalo grass in the autumn were considered the best. The grass at that time of year was dry and fibrous, producing dung that burned long and hot. Spring chips, by contrast, were nearly worthless. Cattle grazing on lush green grass produced wet, loose dung that dried into a crumbly, fast-burning material. It provided a brief, intense flame, but little sustained heat. The most prized chips came from cattle that had been eating wild plums. Plum trees grew along creek beds and in sheltered valleys. In late summer and early autumn, cattle would eat the fallen fruit. The plum pits, being hard and dense, passed through the digestive system intact. Chips, filled with plum pits, burned longer than any other type, the pits glowing like small coals. These chips were reserved for nighttime fires when sustained heat was most needed. Gathering chips was a daily chore. Families would walk the prairie with burlap sacks or baskets, collecting chips wherever they found them. The work was repetitive and time-consuming, but it was essential. A family needed a constant supply to maintain their fires through the winter. The chips were stacked near the house in large piles. A well-prepared family might have a pile 12 feet high, representing weeks or months of gathering. The size of the chip pile was a visible indicator of a family's readiness for winter. A tall pile meant security. A small pile meant hardship ahead. The chips were burned in cast iron stoves, the same stoves that would have burned wood in a different environment. The stoves were designed to maximise efficiency, with dampers and vents to control airflow and heat output. Well-tended stove could maintain a steady temperature for hours on a single load of chips. However, chips burned faster than wood. They had to be added more frequently. This meant someone had to tend the fire throughout the day and night. Letting the fire go out was not just an inconvenience, it was a risk. Restarting a fire required matches or flint and steel, and both were valuable. More importantly, a cold house could become dangerously cold within hours during a winter storm. The smell of burning chips was distinctive but not unpleasant. Accounts describe it as similar to burning grass or straw. There was no fecal odour. The drying process and the herbivorous diet of the animals meant the fuel was clean. Smoke was minimal. Chips produced a thin, pale smoke that dispersed quickly. This was an advantage in a dwelling with limited ventilation. A wood fire in a poorly ventilated room could fill the space with smoke, making it difficult to breathe. A chip fire did not. As the bison were hunted to near extinction, settlers transitioned to using cow chips. Domestic cattle were becoming more common on the plains as ranching expanded. Cow chips functioned identically to buffalo chips, and the same principles of selection and use applied. In addition to chips, settlers used other plant-based fuels. Hay twists were bundles of prairie grass, tightly knotted to slow their burn rate. A well-made hay twist could burn for several minutes, providing a quick burst of heat. They were useful for starting fires or for cooking tasks that required high heat for a short time. Sunflower stalks were another option. Sunflowers grew wild on the prairie and were also cultivated by settlers. The stalks, when dried, were woody and burned with a bright hot flame. However, they were consumed quickly and provided little sustained heat. Corn cobs, a byproduct of corn harvesting, were also burned. They burned cleaner than chips and provided moderate heat. Families saved their cobs throughout the harvest season, storing them for winter use. Each of these fuels had advantages and disadvantages. None matched the convenience or energy density of wood. But wood was not available. The settlers adapted. They learned to read the landscape, to assess fuel quality, to manage their fires with precision. The chip economy was not unique to the American plains. In other treeless regions, similar systems developed. In parts of Central Asia, dried dung from sheep and cattle was the primary fuel. In Tibet, yak dung served the same purpose. In each case, the principle was the same. When wood is absent, use what the animals provide. This adaptation required a shift in cultural attitudes. European and American settlers arrived on the plains with expectations shaped by forested environments. The idea of burning animal waste was foreign and distasteful, but survival demanded flexibility. Within a generation, chip burning had become routine, unremarkable, a simple fact of life on the prairie. The legacy of the chip economy faded quickly. By the early 20th century, railroads had made coal affordable. Later, oil and gas replaced coal. The need to gather and burn dung disappeared. The skill, once universal among plains homesteaders, became a historical curiosity. But the chips themselves remain in the archaeological record. Excavations of abandoned homesteads sometimes reveal charred fragments of dung in the ash pits of old stoves, silent evidence of a fuel source that sustained thousands of families through winters that would otherwise have been unsurvivable. The relationship between a frontier family and their fuel supply was not casual. It was a matter of planning, labour and vigilance. The chip pile was the visible embodiment of that relationship. A chip pile was built near the house, usually on the leeward side to protect it from the prevailing wind. The chips were stacked methodically, layer upon layer, creating a structure that could reach 12 feet in height and occupy a significant footprint. The construction of the pile began in late summer or early autumn. This was when the chips from the previous year's grazing had dried sufficiently to be collected in large quantities. Families would organise gathering expeditions, sometimes spending entire days walking the prairie with wagons or carts. Children were often assigned this task. It was physically easy enough for young people to manage, and it freed adults for other work. The children would fan out across the grassland, filling sacks or baskets and bringing them back to the wagon. A full day's effort might yield several £100 of chips. The chips were not simply dumped in a heap. They were stacked with care. The base of the pile was broad, providing stability. As the pile grew, the perimeter was built up to create a rim that held the interior chips in place. The result was a conical or dome-shaped structure. The height of the pile served a practical purpose. It kept the chips off the ground, reducing the risk of moisture wicking up from the soil. It also made the pile a landmark. From a distance, a tall chip pile was a sign that a family lived nearby, that they were prepared, that they had invested the labour necessary to survive the winter. But the pile was more than a fuel depot. It was a statement. In a landscape where resources were scarce and survival was uncertain, the chip pile communicated competence. It said, "We understand this environment. We know what is required. We have done the work. Neighbours would notice." A family with a tall chip pile was respected. A family with a small or non-existent pile was pitied or judged. The pile was a form of social currency, a visible measure of a household's readiness. Maintaining the pile was an ongoing task. Chips had to be added regularly throughout the season. As winter approached, the gathering intensified. Every dry day was an opportunity to add to the stockpile. Wet weather made gathering impossible as damp chips would not dry properly and were prone to mould. The pile was also vulnerable. A strong wind could scatter the top layers. Livestock, if not properly fenced, might knock it over while foraging. Prairie fires, though rare in winter, could ignite a pile if embers blew in from a distant burn. To protect against these risks, some families built simple enclosures around their piles. A ring of posts with horizontal rails created a barrier that held the chips in place and deterred animals. Others covered the pile with a tarp or old canvas weighted down with stones. Drawing from the pile was done with care. Chips were removed from the top or sides, never from the base, to prevent collapse. A family burning chips for cooking and heating might use £50 to £100 per day during the coldest months. A pile that seemed enormous in October could be reduced to a fraction of its size by February. Running out of chips before spring was a serious problem. It meant the family would have to burn alternative fuels, hay twists, corn cobs, furniture, whatever was combustible. In extreme cases, it meant cold nights, frozen water, and the risk of hypothermia. To avoid this, experienced homesteaders calculated their needs carefully. They estimated the length of the winter, the severity of the cold, and the size of their dwelling. They aimed to gather more than they thought they would need, building in a margin for error. This calculation was not purely mechanical. It required judgment. Winters varied. Some were mild, with long stretches of moderate weather. Others were brutal, with sustained cold and repeated blizzards. A family that guessed wrong faced hardship. The chip pile also had a temporal dimension. It marked the passage of the year. In spring, as the weather warmed and the need for heating decreased, the pile shrank rapidly. By summer, it might be reduced to a small remnant, the chips scattered or used for other purposes. Then, in late summer, the cycle began again. New chips were collected. The pile was rebuilt. The labour of the previous year was repeated. This rhythm was part of the annual routine, as predictable as planting and harvest. For children growing up on the plains, the chip pile was a familiar landmark. It was a place where they worked, where they learned to identify good chips from poor ones, where they understood viscerally that survival depended on preparation. The pile was also a teaching tool. Parents used it to instill lessons about diligence, foresight, and the consequences of neglect. A child who failed to gather chips when asked might be reminded of that failure on a cold night when the stove needed feeding. The social dimension of the chip pile extended beyond individual families. In some communities, neighbours would assist each other with gathering, especially in the case of widows, the elderly, or families struck by illness or injury. A barn-raising mentality applied to chip gathering as well, collective effort in service of mutual survival. However, this assistance was not guaranteed. In harder times, or in more isolated areas, families were on their own. The chip pile became a measure not just of preparedness but of isolation, a physical manifestation of the distance between households and the limits of communal support. The 12-foot monument, then, was more than a stack of dried dung. It was a calendar, a social signal, a survival tool, and a symbol of the relationship between human effort and environmental constraint. It stood as evidence that the settlers had adapted, that they had learned to read the landscape and extract from it what they needed. And when the railroads came, when coal became affordable and wood became accessible, the chip piles disappeared. The skill of building them, of maintaining them, of judging their adequacy, faded within a generation. The monuments were abandoned, scattered by wind, reclaimed by the prairie. But for the families who built them, the chip pile was survival, made visible. It was the answer to winter, measured in height and volume, stacked one piece at a time against the cold. Sleep on the frontier was not a continuous 8-hour block. It was segmented, interrupted, shaped by the demands of survival. The pattern that emerged was not unique to the American plains. Historical evidence suggests it was once common across much of the pre-industrial world. The pattern was called two sleeps, or segmented sleep. It worked like this. Families went to bed shortly after nightfall, entering what was called first sleep. They would sleep for several hours, typically 3 to 4. Then, around midnight or 1 in the morning, they would wake. This waking was not accidental, it was expected. The period between first sleep and second sleep lasted 1 to 2 hours. During this time, people were quietly active. They tended the fire, they spoke in low voices, they prayed, or thought, or simply lay in the dark, waiting. After this interval they returned, to sleep. This was second sleep, which lasted until dawn. The total amount of sleep was roughly the same as in a consolidated pattern, but it was divided by a wakeful interlude. The reasons for this pattern are debated. Some researchers argue it was natural, aligned with human circadian rhythms before the advent of artificial lighting. Others suggest it was practical, a response to the challenges of maintaining warmth and security through the night. On the frontier, the practical explanation is compelling. The fire was the centre of survival. It provided heat, light, and the ability to cook. Letting it go out was dangerous. A cold house in the middle of a plains winter could drop to freezing within hours. Restarting a fire from scratch required matches or other ignition sources, which were valuable and sometimes unavailable. To prevent the fire from dying, someone had to tend it. This meant waking periodically to add fuel and adjust the dampers. The interval between first and second, sleep was an ideal time for this task. The person who woke for this purpose varied. In some households, it was the man. In others, it was the woman. In larger families, the responsibility might rotate. Whoever it was, the routine was the same. They would rise from the bed, moving carefully to avoid waking others. The interior of the dugout or sod house was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the stove. They would open the stove door and check the coals. If the fire was low, they would add chips or hay twists, adjusting the airflow to encourage the fuel to catch. This was delicate work. Adding too much fuel too quickly could smother the coals. Adding too little would not sustain the fire. The person tending the fire had to judge the state of the coals, the amount of fuel to add, and the setting of the dampers. Once the fire was secured, they might remain awake for a while. The interval between sleeps was a time for reflection. In the quiet darkness, with the rest of the family asleep, there was space for thought. Some accounts describe this time as being used for conversation. Couples would speak in whispers, discussing the day's events or making plans for the future. Parents might check on children, adjusting blankets or soothing a restless sleeper. Others used the time for prayer. The stillness of the night, the absence of distraction, made it conducive to spiritual practice. Prayers were quiet, personal, a private dialogue in the midst of shared space. The interval was also a time for bodily needs. Chamber pots were used rather than venturing outside into the cold. In a dugout or sod house, the outdoor privy was a separate structure, reached by stepping out into the wind and snow. At night, in winter, this was avoided if at all possible. The two-sleep pattern also had a physiological dimension. The human body's core temperature drops during sleep. In a cold environment, this drop can become uncomfortable or even dangerous. Waking periodically allows the body to generate heat through movement and to adjust bedding or clothing as needed. For children, the pattern was absorbed without question. They grew up with it. The idea of sleeping through the entire night was foreign. Waking in the middle of the night was normal, expected, part of the rhythm of life. The pattern extended beyond individual households. In medieval Europe, church records and legal documents reference first sleep and second sleep as common terms. People scheduled activities around them. A meeting might be set for after first sleep, a time everyone understood. This suggests the pattern was not unique to frontier life, but was a broader human adaptation to environments without artificial lighting and centralized heating. The darkness and cold of pre-industrial nights shaped sleep in ways that are difficult for modern people to imagine. However, the two-sleep pattern began to fade with industrialization. As artificial lighting became common, the night was extended. People stayed awake later, reducing the total time available for sleep. The wakeful interval between sleep shortened and eventually disappeared. By the 20th century, the pattern was largely forgotten. Sleep became consolidated into a single block, and waking in the middle of the night was viewed as abnormal, a sign of insomnia or disturbance. But on the frontier, in the dugout, the two-sleep pattern was functional. It ensured the fire did not die. It provided a natural check on the household's warmth and safety, and it created a rhythm that aligned with the demands of the environment. The fire itself was more than a heat source. It was a focal point, a presence, a living thing that required care. Tending it was not a chore so much as a relationship. The family depended on the fire depended on them. In the interval between sleeps, the person tending the fire was alone with this responsibility. The house was silent except for the breathing of sleepers and the faint crackle of the stove. The darkness was total beyond the small circle of warmth. This solitude was both isolating and intimate. It was a moment of connection with the essential work of survival, unmediated by daylight or activity. It was a reminder that warmth was not guaranteed, that it had to be maintained, that the night was something to be managed, not merely endured. And then, with the fire secured, the person would return to bed. They would pull the blankets close, feel the warmth of the bodies beside them, and let themselves drift back into second sleep. The night would continue, the fire would burn, and in a few hours dawn would come and the cycle would begin again. Heat in a dugout or sod house was unevenly distributed. The stove radiated warmth in a small radius, but the far corners of the room remained cold. The thick earthen walls moderated temperature but did not generate it. At night, when the fire was damped down to conserve fuel, the ambient temperature could drop significantly. To counter this, settlers developed methods of delivering localized heat directly to where it was needed: the bed. The goal was not to heat the entire sleeping area, but to create pockets of warmth that made rest possible. The most common tool was the soapstone. Soapstone is a metamorphic rock composed primarily of talc. It has a high heat capacity, meaning it absorbs a large amount of thermal energy and releases it slowly. It is also soft enough to be carved and shaped, making it useful for a variety of purposes. On the frontier, soapstones were used as portable heat reservoirs. A piece of soapstone, roughly the size of a brick, would be placed directly into the stove among the coals. It would be left there for an hour or more, absorbing heat until it was too hot to touch with bare hands. When it was time for bed, the soapstone would be removed using tongs or a thick cloth. It would be wrapped in rags or an old towel to protect against burns and to slow the release of heat. The wrapped stone would then be placed at the foot of the bed, under the blankets. The heat from the stone radiated outward, warming the lower portion of the bed. Feet, which are particularly vulnerable to cold due to their distance from the body's core, were kept warm. The stone would remain hot for several hours, often lasting through first sleep and into the interval before second sleep. Some families used multiple soapstones, placing them at different points in the bed to create zones of warmth. Others used a single large stone, relying on it to warm the central area where the sleepers clustered. The soapstone was not a permanent solution. It cooled gradually, and by morning it was typically at room temperature, but during the coldest hours of the night it provided critical warmth. An alternative to the soapstone was the bed warmer. This was a more specialised tool, typically made from copper or brass. It consisted of a lidded pan attached to a long wooden handle. The pan was filled with hot coals from the stove. The bed warmer was used to preheat the mattress. Before anyone went to bed, the warmer would be filled with glowing coals and slid between the layers of bedding. It would be moved back and forth, warming the fabric and driving out the chill. The process took several minutes. The person wielding the bed warmer had to be careful not to scorch the bedding or spill hot coals. The handle allowed them to maneuver the pan without putting their hands near the heat. Once the bed was warmed, the bed warmer was removed and set aside. The coals would be returned to the stove or left to cool in a safe location. The bed, now warm, would retain that heat for a short time, making the initial entry into sleep more comfortable. Bed warmers were more common in wealthier households, or among families who had brought such items with them from the East. They were not essential, but they were valued. A well-made bed warmer could last for decades and was sometimes passed down as a household item of significance. Both soapstones and bed warmers addressed the same problem. The human body loses heat rapidly when lying still in a cold environment. Blankets provide insulation, reducing the rate of heat loss, but they do not generate heat. Without an external heat source, the body must produce all the warmth needed to maintain core temperature. This is metabolically expensive and can be difficult to sustain over a full night. By introducing an external heat source, a hot stone or pre-warmed bedding, the metabolic burden is reduced. The body does not have to work as hard to stay warm. Sleep is deeper and more restful. There were other methods as well. Some families heated bricks in the stove and used them in place of soapstones. Bricks were more readily available and cost nothing, though they did not retain heat as long as soapstone. Metal containers filled with hot water served a similar purpose. A stoppered jar or bottle filled with boiling water and wrapped in cloth could be tucked into the bed. The water would cool slowly, providing warmth for hours. In Europe, similar practices were documented. Warming pans, functionally identical to American bed warmers, were used across the continent. In colder regions, hot stones or heated sand were placed in cloth bags and used as bed warmers. The principle was universal. Localized heat delivery was more efficient than attempting to heat the entire sleeping area. This was especially true in earth-sheltered dwellings, where the thermal mass of the walls absorbed heat from the air, making it difficult to raise the ambient temperature significantly. The use of these tools required planning. Soapstones had to be placed in the fire well before bedtime. Bed warmers had to be prepared and used immediately before sleep. The process became part of the evening routine, as automatic as banking the fire or closing the door. For children, the ritual of warming the bed was a sign that the day was ending. It was a signal to settle down, to prepare for sleep. The warmth of the stone at their feet was a small comfort in an otherwise harsh environment. The stones and warmers were also a form of care. Preparing them was an act of service, one family member ensuring the comfort of another. In households where resources were scarce and comforts were few, these small gestures carried weight. The soapstone itself was sometimes a treasured object. A good stone, large and dense, was kept for years. It might be one of the few possessions a family brought with them when they moved to a new homestead or upgraded to a frame house. As heating technology improved, the need for soapstones and bed warmers diminished. Stoves became more efficient, capable of maintaining higher temperatures through the night. Later, central heating eliminated the need for localized heat sources entirely. But in the dugout, on a winter night when the wind howled across the prairie and the temperature dropped below zero, the soapstone at the foot of the bed was not a quaint historical artifact. It was survival. It was the difference between shivering through the night and sleeping soundly. It was a small piece of heated rock, wrapped in rags, radiating warmth into the darkness. The bed itself was not a solid, manufactured object. It was an assemblage of materials, each chosen based on availability and cost. The foundation of most frontier beds was the tick, a large bag made from woven fabric and filled with whatever could be gathered or spared. The tick served as both mattress and container. It was typically sewn from heavy cotton cloth, often repurposed flour sacks stitched together. The seams had to be tight to prevent the filling from escaping. A poorly sewn tick would leak chaff or straw through the gaps, leaving a mess on the floor and a flattened, useless mattress. The most common filling was straw. After the wheat or oat harvest, the stalks were threshed to separate the grain from the stem. What remained was straw. long, hollow, dry stems with no nutritional value but substantial volume. It was abundant and free. Filling a tick with straw was straightforward. The bag was opened at one end, and armfuls of straw were stuffed inside until the tick was full and firm. The opening was then sewn shut. The result was a mattress several inches thick, large enough for 2 or 3 people to sleep on. However, straw had significant drawbacks. It was rigid. The hollow stems poked through the fabric, jabbing into skin and making it difficult to find a comfortable position. Settlers described the sensation as sleeping on a bed of needles. Straw also compressed quickly under body weight. A fresh tick might be soft and yielding for the first few nights, but within a week it would flatten into a hard, uneven surface. The stalks broke and compacted, losing their structure. By midwinter, a straw tick was often no thicker than a folded blanket. The material also harboured pests. Fleas, mites, and bedbugs thrived in straw. The hollow stems provided shelter. The warmth of sleeping bodies attracted the insects. Accounts from the period frequently mention the discomfort of flea bites during the night, a constant irritation that was accepted as unavoidable. To mitigate these problems, families replaced the straw in their ticks seasonally. In the autumn, after the harvest, old straw was emptied out and burned. Fresh straw was gathered and used to refill the tick. This provided a few months of relative comfort before the cycle of compression and infestation began again. Chaff was a preferred alternative to straw, though it was less abundant. Chaff is the husks and broken fragments that separate from grain during threshing. It is softer than straw, less likely to poke through fabric, and more comfortable to sleep on. The chaff-filled tick was quieter. Straw rustled loudly with every movement, a constant crackling that could disturb sleep. Chaff settled more quietly, allowing for a subtler shift in position. However, chaff had its own limitations. It was finer than straw and more prone to sifting through the weave of the tick fabric. A chaff-filled tick required tighter stitching and a denser weave. Even then, a thin layer of chaff dust would accumulate beneath the bed over time. Chaff also compressed, though not as quickly as straw. A chaff tick might last a full season before needing to be refilled. But chaff was a byproduct of grain processing, and the quantity available was limited by the size of the harvest. Many families could not spare enough chaff to fill an entire tick and used a combination of chaff and straw, layering the softer material on top. Corn husks were another option. After the corn harvest, the dried husks were stripped from the ears and saved. They could be shredded and used as mattress filling. Corn husks were softer than straw, but noisier than chaff. They rustled and crackled with every movement, earning beds filled with them the nickname Kansas feather beds, a joke that referenced their loudness. Despite the noise, corn husk ticks were popular in regions where corn was the primary crop. The husks were abundant and otherwise had little use. They were also more resistant to pests than straw, though not immune. Each of these materials was temporary. They degraded over the course of a season and had to be replaced. This meant that maintaining a bed was an ongoing task, part of the household routine. The tick was emptied, cleaned, refilled, and sewn shut, a cycle that repeated year after year. The quality of sleep on these mattresses was poor by modern standards. The surfaces were uneven, prone to lumps and depressions. The materials compressed unevenly, creating hard spots under the hips and shoulders. The rustling of straw or husks made it difficult to move without noise, but these beds were not compared to modern standards. They were compared to the alternatives, sleeping on the bare floor on a wooden bench or on the ground outside. In that context, even a straw tick was a significant comfort. The tick also provided insulation. The layer of organic material between the sleeper and the floor reduced heat loss. The floor of a dugout or sod house was earth, which could be cold and damp. The tick created a barrier, keeping the body elevated and insulated from the ground's chill. In some households, multiple ticks were used. A coarse straw tick might serve as the base layer, providing bulk and insulation. On top of it, a thinner chaff or feather tick would be placed, offering a softer sleeping surface. This layering created a bed that was both functional and relatively comfortable. The work of maintaining these beds fell largely to women and children. Gathering the straw or chaff, sewing the ticks, emptying and refilling them. These were domestic tasks, part of the seasonal rhythm of the household. Children learned early how to sew a tight seam, how to stuff a tick evenly, how to recognise when the filling had degraded and needed replacement. These skills were practical and necessary, taught by example and reinforced through repetition. The tick itself, when worn out, could be repurposed. The fabric was cut up and used for rags, patches, or other household needs. Nothing was wasted. Every material had a life cycle, and when one use ended, another began. Despite their shortcomings, straw and chaff beds served their purpose. They provided a place to sleep that was off the ground, insulated, and relatively soft. They were affordable, made from materials that were byproducts of farming, and they were adaptable, allowing families to improve or maintain them based on what the land provided each season. The bed was not a luxury. It was a tool for survival, as essential as the stove or the walls. And like all tools on the frontier, it was shaped by scarcity, maintained through labour, and valued for its function rather than its comfort. Not all beds were filled with straw. For families with resources, time and patience, there was an alternative, the feather bed. This was not simply a better mattress. It was a different category of object entirely, one that carried economic, social and emotional weight far beyond its function as bedding. A feather bed was a tick filled with the down and feathers of birds, typically domestic geese. The process of creating one was long and labour-intensive. It began with the birds themselves. Geese were common on frontier farms. They were hardy, relatively easy to raise, and provided multiple benefits. They produced eggs, meat, and feathers. The feathers were valuable, used for pillows, quilts, and mattresses. Collecting feathers was done through plucking. Several times a year, usually in spring and autumn, the geese would be caught and their feathers removed by hand. This was called live plucking, and it was a delicate process. If done incorrectly, it could injure the bird. If done correctly, the feathers would regrow and the bird could be plucked again the following season. The feathers collected through plucking were sorted. The softest, finest feathers, the down from the breast and underbelly, were the most valuable. These were set aside for mattresses. The coarser wing and tail feathers were used for pillows or other purposes. Accumulating enough down to fill a mattress took years. A single goose might yield a few ounces of usable down per plucking. A full feather bed required 30 to 50 pounds of down. This meant plucking dozens of geese over multiple seasons. For this reason, feather beds were often intergenerational projects. A mother might begin collecting down when her daughter was a child, adding to the stock year by year. By the time the daughter was ready to marry, the feather bed would be complete, a gift that represented years of preparation. The feather bed was more than bedding. It was a dowry item, a sign that the bride's family had invested in her future. It was portable, wealth, something that could be carried to a new household and that retained its value over time. The bed itself was constructed with care. The tick was made from the finest fabric available, often a tightly woven cotton or linen. The weave had to be dense enough to prevent the down from escaping. Feathers, especially the fine down, were prone to working their way through loose fabric. The tick was sewn with small, tight stitches. Some were quilted in a pattern of squares or diamonds to keep the down evenly distributed. Without this quilting, the down would shift to the edges of the tick, leaving the centre flat and the sides overstuffed. Filling the tick was a delicate process. The down had to be fluffed and spread evenly. It was added gradually, layer by layer, until the tick was full. The opening was then sewn shut with a seam that could be opened and reclosed if the bed needed to be refilled or adjusted. The finished feather bed was thick, soft, and warm. It conformed to the body, providing support without the hardness of straw or the unevenness of chaff. It was also an effective insulator, trapping air within the down and creating a barrier against the cold. Sleeping on a feather bed was a different experience from sleeping on straw. The body sank into the down, enveloped in softness. The bed was silent, with none of the rustling or crackling of plant-based fillings. It was warm, retaining body heat, and radiating it back. But the feather bed was also a responsibility. It required care and maintenance. The down had to be aired regularly to prevent it from becoming damp and musty. The tick had to be protected from pests, which would nest in the down if given the opportunity. Feather beds were valuable, and they were treated as such. They appeared in wills and estate inventories, listed alongside land, livestock, and other significant assets. A feather bed might be bequeathed to a specific child, a token of affection and a practical gift. The economic value of a feather bed was substantial. In a cash-poor economy, where most transactions were conducted through barter or trade, a feather bed could serve as currency. It could be sold, traded, or used as collateral. This value also made feather beds targets for theft. In settlements where law enforcement was minimal, the loss of a feather bed was a serious matter. It was not just the loss of comfort, but the loss of accumulated labour and wealth. Despite their value, feather beds were not universal. Many frontier families never owned one. The investment of time and resources was too great. For these families, straw or chaff was the only option, and the feather bed remained an aspiration, something they might achieve in the future if their circumstances improved. There was also a practical limitation. Feather beds were difficult to transport. They were bulky and had to be kept dry. Families moving west in covered wagons had to make hard decisions about what to bring and what to leave behind. So, feather bed, if they owned one, was often among the items left behind, too cumbersome to carry across 1,000 miles of trail. For those who did bring feather beds west, the bed was a link to their previous life. It was a reminder of the home they had left, the family they had come from. It was continuity in a landscape that was radically different from anything they had known. The process of sleeping on a feather bed also had a ritualistic quality. The bed was prepared carefully each evening. It was fluffed to redistribute the down. The blankets were arranged. The bed was treated with respect, not just as an object, but as a valuable possession. Children growing up in a household with a feather bed understood its significance. They were taught to handle it carefully, not to jump on it or treat it roughly. The bed was a symbol of the family's status and stability. In contrast to straw or chaff, which were replaced seasonally, a well-maintained feather bed could last for decades. Some beds were used for 50 years or more, passed from one generation to the next. The down might be redistributed or supplemented, but the bed itself endured. This longevity added to the bed's value. It was not a consumable, but a durable good, an investment that paid dividends over time in the form of warmth, comfort, and social standing. The feather bed was also gendered. It was typically the woman's domain, part of the household goods she brought to the marriage or inherited from her mother. The creation and maintenance of the bed were feminine tasks, part of the domestic sphere. But the bed served everyone in the household. It was where the family slept, where children were born, where the sick were tended. It was a central piece of furniture, both functionally and symbolically. In the context of earth-sheltered dwellings, the feather bed was a counterbalance to the harshness of the environment. The dugout or sod house was dark, damp, and rough. The feather bed was soft, warm, and refined. It was a small piece of civilization in a landscape that often felt uncivilized. And when the family eventually moved into a frame house, when the dugout was abandoned and the sod house left to crumble, the feather bed went with them. It was one of the few items that made the transition, a symbol of continuity across different stages of frontier life. Privacy, as a concept, had little relevance in the dugout. The structure was small, typically a single room no more than 12 feet square. Within that space, the entire family lived, worked, and slept. Separation was not possible. The bed was shared. 2 people to a mattress was common. 3 or 4 was not unusual, especially in families with multiple children. The sleeping arrangement was dictated by practicality. Fewer beds meant less material, less labour, and more efficient use of the limited space. Children slept together by necessity. In some households, all the children shared a single large tick placed on the floor or on a simple wooden frame. They arranged themselves by size, the smallest in the middle where they would be warmest, the larger children on the outside. This clustering served a thermal purpose. Multiple bodies in close proximity generated and shared heat. The collective warmth was greater than the sum of individual contributions. In a cold environment, this was not incidental. It was essential. Adults also shared beds, though the arrangement varied. In a 2-parent household, the parents typically had their own sleeping space, separate from the children. In multi-generational households, Grandparents might share the bed with the parents, or they might sleep with the older children. The arrangement was fluid, changing based on circumstances. If a child was ill, they might be moved to the parents' bed for closer monitoring. If a guest or relative stayed with the family, sleeping arrangements shifted to accommodate them. The beds themselves were positioned strategically within the room. The primary bed was usually placed as far from the door as possible to minimise exposure to drafts. The door was the weakest point in the thermal envelope, and cold air entered there whenever it was opened. Secondary sleeping spaces, pallets on the floor, smaller ticks, were arranged around the room based on the available floor space and proximity to the stove. The warmest spot was nearest the stove, but that spot was also the most exposed to changes in the fire's intensity. A spot farther from the stove was colder but more stable. The practice of multiple people sleeping in one bed was not unique to the frontier. It was common in medieval Europe, in colonial America, and in many other pre-industrial societies. The phrase "to pig" was used in England to describe this arrangement, a reference to the way pigs huddle together for warmth. The sleeping arrangement had social dimensions beyond its thermal function. Shared sleep meant shared space, and shared space created intimacy. Conversations happened in the bed that did not happen elsewhere. Secrets were whispered. Worries were shared. For couples, the bed was one of the few semi-private spaces available. Even here, privacy was limited. Children might be sleeping an arm's length away. The walls of the dugout did not provide sound insulation, but the darkness and the quietness of night created a psychological boundary, a sense of separation even when physical separation was impossible. For children, the shared bed was a place of both comfort and conflict. Siblings fought over space, over blankets, over who was too close or taking up too much room. But they also comforted each other, shared warmth, and developed bonds that came from proximity and necessity. The bed was also a social leveller. In the darkness, under the blankets, distinctions of age and status were minimised. Everyone was reduced to the basic need for warmth and rest. The youngest child and the eldest grandparent shared the same space, the same vulnerability to the cold. This enforced intimacy had psychological effects. On one hand, it fostered closeness, a sense of family cohesion. On the other hand, it created tension. The lack of personal space could be stifling. There was nowhere to retreat, no room of one's own. For adolescents and young adults, the shared sleeping arrangement was particularly challenging. The transition from childhood to adulthood involved a growing desire for privacy, for autonomy. But on the frontier in the dugout, that desire could not be satisfied. The physical constraints of the environment overrode individual preferences. The arrangement also had practical challenges. Different people have different sleep patterns. Some are restless, moving frequently during the night. Others snore. Some generate more body heat than others. In a shared bed, these individual differences had to be negotiated, either through explicit discussion or through tacit adjustment. Blankets were shared as well, often a single, large quilt covering multiple people. This created a constant tug-of-war. One person pulling the blanket toward themselves left another exposed. The solution was to sleep close together, minimizing the gaps through which warm air could escape and cold air could enter. The number of people in a bed also affected the quality of the mattress. A straw chaff tick designed for 2 people would compress more quickly under the weight of 4. The centre of the bed would flatten, creating a depression toward which everyone would roll during the night. To counteract this, some families used multiple layers of ticks, stacking them to create a thicker sleeping surface. Others accepted the compression and refilled the ticks more frequently. The bed was also a workspace during the day. In a single-room dwelling, furniture served multiple purposes. The bed might be used as a bench for sitting, a table for folding laundry, or a play area for children. At night, it returned to its primary function. This multi-use nature meant the bed was rarely perfectly made or maintained. It was a lived-in space, subject to the wear and disorder of daily life. The distinction between public and private space did not exist in the same way it does in larger homes with multiple rooms. In medieval Europe, the shared bed was even more common. Entire households, family members, servants, and sometimes guests, slept in a single room, often in a single large bed or on pallets arranged around the central hearth. The practice was so widespread that it was not remarked upon in most historical documents. It was simply the norm. The shared bed was also documented in taverns and inns. Travellers who could not afford a private room would share a bed with strangers, a practice that continued into the 19th century in some regions. This was considered unremarkable, a practical response to limited space and resources. On the frontier, the shared bed was a necessity that became a tradition. Families who eventually moved into larger homes with multiple bedrooms sometimes continued the practice, not out of necessity but out of habit or preference. The warmth and comfort of sleeping in proximity to others had become familiar, but for many, the transition to individual beds was a marker of progress, a sign that the hardships of the dugout were behind them. The ability to sleep alone, or with only one other person, was a luxury that symbolised stability and success. The shared bed in the dugout was survival. It was efficient use of scarce resources. It was thermal management. And it was intimacy born of constraint, a closeness that came not from choice, but from the simple fact that there was nowhere else to go. The line between human and animal space was not always clearly defined. In some frontier homesteads, and more commonly in medieval European cottages, livestock were brought indoors during the coldest months. This was not a sign of affection for the animals, but a practical response to the twin problems of keeping the animals alive and keeping the humans warm. A cow, a sheep, or a pig generates heat through its metabolism. A single cow can produce as much heat as a small stove, raising the ambient temperature of an enclosed space by several degrees. In a well-insulated sod house or dugout, this additional heat could make the difference between a livable interior and one that was dangerously cold. The practice of housing livestock indoors had deep historical roots. In northern Europe, particularly in regions with harsh winters, the longhouse design was common. These structures were divided into two sections, one end for the family, the other for the animals. The animals entered through a separate door, but the interior space was often connected, allowing heat from the animals to flow into the human living area. The division was sometimes minimal, a low partition, or even just an imaginary line. The warmth from the animals was the primary benefit, but there were others. Keeping the animals inside protected them from predators and from the cold, which could kill livestock as easily as it could kill people. The animals represented economic value, meat, milk, labour, and protecting that value was essential. On the American frontier, the practice was less common but not unknown. Families who owned a cow or a few chickens might bring them into the dugout during particularly severe weather. The animals would be kept in a corner, separated from the sleeping area by a hanging blanket or a simple wooden barrier. The arrangement was not comfortable for either humans or animals. The smell was significant. Livestock produced waste continuously, and the odour of manure in a confined space was overpowering. The animals also made noise, lowing, clucking, shuffling that disrupted sleep. But the warmth was undeniable. Accounts from medieval Europe describe the difference between a cottage with animals inside and one without. The former could maintain a temperature above freezing even when the exterior temperature dropped well below zero. The latter could not. The metabolic heat of a cow is produced through digestion. Ruminants like cattle have a complex digestive system that ferments plant material in a specialized stomach. This fermentation generates heat as a byproduct. A healthy, well-fed cow can produce several thousand BTUs of heat per hour, equivalent to a small space heater. This heat radiates from the animal's body and is conducted through the air to the surrounding space. In a small enclosed structure, the effect is noticeable within minutes. The air temperature rises, the cold edge is taken off the room. For families in earth-sheltered dwellings, this supplemental heat reduced the amount of fuel needed to keep the interior habitable. Burning fewer buffalo chips or less straw meant the stored fuel lasted longer, providing a margin of safety against unexpectedly long or severe winters. However, the practice required management. The animals needed to be fed and watered. In winter, water froze quickly, and keeping a supply liquid required effort. Hay and grain had to be brought inside and stored where the animals could access it. This added to the clutter and disorder of an already cramped space. Waste removal was a constant chore. The animals could not be allowed to foul the living area indefinitely. Their waste had to be shoveled out regularly and disposed of outside. In the middle of a blizzard, this was an unpleasant task, but it was necessary. The risk of disease was also a concern. Animals carry parasites and pathogens that can transfer to humans. Close quarters increased the likelihood of transmission. Respiratory infections, skin conditions, and gastrointestinal illnesses could spread from animal to human, especially in children who played near the animals or in areas where waste had accumulated. Despite these drawbacks, the practice persisted because the benefits outweighed the costs. The additional warmth was too valuable to forego, especially in regions where fuel was scarce or expensive. The animals themselves adapted to the indoor environment. Cows that were brought inside regularly became accustomed to the routine. They learned to tolerate the confinement and the proximity to humans. Chickens roosted on beams or in corners, settling in for the night as the family did. In some cases, the animals provided more than heat. A cow kept inside could be milked without venturing into the cold. Chickens continued to lay eggs, albeit at a reduced rate during winter, providing a source of protein. The animals were not just heaters, but active contributors to the household economy. The social dynamics of sharing space with animals were complex. For children, the animals were a source of fascination and sometimes companionship. A calf or a lamb became a playmate, something to interact with during the long hours of confinement indoors. For adults, the animals were a reminder of the precariousness of their situation. The fact that survival required bringing livestock into the living space was a sign of how marginal their existence was. It was not how they had lived in the East, not how they imagined a proper household should function. But it worked. The cow in the next room, or in the corner of the same room, was survival. It was a heat source that required no fuel, a living furnace that converted hay into warmth. In medieval Europe, this arrangement was so common that it shaped the design of buildings. The longhouse was optimised for cohabitation, with drainage channels for animal waste, partitions to separate species, and ventilation to manage the accumulation of moisture and odours. On the frontier, the arrangements were more improvised. A blanket hung on a rope, a stack of crates creating a barrier. The solutions were temporary, adapted to the specific circumstances of each household. As conditions improved, as families built larger homes with separate barns, the practice of housing animals indoors declined. The barn became the proper place for livestock, and the house became exclusively human space. The separation was a marker of progress, of moving beyond the necessity of shared warmth. But in the dugout, in the sod house, during the coldest winters, the cow in the next room was not an oddity. It was a strategy. It was the difference between burning through the entire chip pile before spring and having enough fuel to last. It was warmth measured not in degrees, but in the steady, patient breathing of a ruminant digesting grass in the darkness. Light inside a dugout was scarce. The structure was designed for thermal efficiency, not illumination. The thick earthen walls and roof blocked sunlight. The small windows, if they existed at all, were minimal, openings just large enough to allow a bit of daylight to penetrate. These windows were rarely fitted with glass. Glass was expensive, fragile, and difficult to transport across the prairie. For most homesteaders, it was a luxury beyond reach. Instead, windows were covered with alternatives that allowed light to pass while blocking wind and cold. Oiled paper was the most common substitute. Heavy paper, often brown wrapping paper or thick parchment, was soaked in linseed oil or another oil until it became translucent. The oil filled the fibres of the paper, allowing light to pass through, while maintaining structural integrity. The oiled paper was then stretched across the window frame and tacked in place. It was not transparent. Objects on the other side could not be seen clearly. But it did allow diffused light to enter, enough to distinguish day from night, and to provide minimal illumination for tasks. The paper was vulnerable, wind tore it, rain weakened it. It had to be replaced periodically, often several times a winter. Families kept a supply of paper and oil on hand for this purpose, treating window maintenance as a routine chore. Even with oiled paper windows, the interior of a dugout was dim. On overcast days, the light that filtered through was grey and weak. On sunny days, it was brighter, but still insufficient for detailed work. This darkness shaped the rhythm of daily life. Tasks requiring good light, Sewing, reading, detailed handwork were done during the middle of the day when the sun was highest and the light was strongest. Work that could be done by touch or memory was saved for morning and evening. The darkness also affected mood. Prolonged exposure to low-light environments can lead to feelings of confinement and depression. Settlers frequently mentioned the oppressive gloom of the dugout, the way it made the days feel longer and the walls feel closer. To counter the darkness, families used artificial light. The options were limited. Candles were common but expensive. They were made from tallow, rendered animal fat, or more rarely beeswax. Tallow candles had a strong, unpleasant smell and produced a smoky, flickering light. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and brighter but were costly. Making candles was a household task, usually done in batches during the autumn. The tallow was melted and poured into moulds or dipped repeatedly onto wicks until the desired thickness was achieved. A day's work might produce several dozen candles, enough to last a few weeks if used sparingly. Candles were rationed. They were lit only when necessary for specific tasks that required light. The rest of the time, the family lived in darkness or relied on the faint glow of the stove. Oil lamps were another option. These were simple devices: a reservoir for oil, a wick, and a chimney to direct the smoke and protect the flame. The oil was typically rendered from animal fat or later purchased as kerosene when it became available. Oil lamps provided steadier light than candles and could burn for several hours on a single filling. But the oil was expensive and the lamps required maintenance. The wicks had to be trimmed. The chimneys had to be cleaned of soot. A neglected lamp would smoke and produce a dim, flickering light. Kerosene, when it became available in the late 19th century, was a significant improvement over tallow. It burned cleaner, brighter, and with less odour. But it was also dangerous. Kerosene was flammable, and spills or leaks could lead to fires. In a sod house, where the walls were organic and the roof was dry grass and straw, fire was an existential threat. Despite these risks, kerosene lamps became standard. They were a marker of modernity, a sign that the family had access to commercial goods and the cash to purchase them. The soft, steady light of a kerosene lamp was a comfort, a small island of brightness in the surrounding darkness. But even with lamps, the light was limited. The lamps illuminated a small radius, perhaps a few feet. Beyond that, the room faded into shadow. The far corners of the dugout were always dark, regions where shapes were indistinct and details were lost. This created a layered environment. The centre of the room, where the stove and the lamp were, was the zone of activity. The edges were the zone of rest, where people slept and where objects were stored. The darkness at the edges was not a problem. It was a feature, a way of dividing the space without physical barriers. Children grew up in this darkness. They learned to navigate the interior by memory, knowing where objects were without needing to see them. They developed a comfort with low light that modern children, raised in electrically lit homes, do not experience. The darkness also shaped sleep. Without artificial light to extend the day, families went to bed shortly after sunset. There was little reason to stay awake. The darkness enforced rest, aligning human activity with the natural cycle of light and dark. This alignment had health benefits. The human circadian rhythm is regulated by exposure to light and darkness. In the absence of artificial light, the body's production of melatonin follows the natural progression of the day, promoting sleep at night and wakefulness during the day. However, the darkness could also be disorienting. On particularly long winter nights, when the sun set in the late afternoon and did not rise until mid-morning, the hours of darkness stretched endlessly. Time became difficult to judge. Without a clock, families relied on the fire, on the rhythm of their own bodies, and on the sounds outside, wind, animals, distant coyotes, to mark the passage of the night. The dim interior was also a safety concern. In the darkness, it was easy to trip over objects, to misjudge distances, to collide with furniture or walls. Burns from the stove or lamps were common, especially among children who moved too quickly in the low light. To mitigate these risks, families kept the interior as organised as possible. Objects were stored in the same places, creating a predictable environment. Pathways were kept clear. the stove, was placed where it could be accessed easily without crossing the room in total darkness. The oiled paper windows, despite their fragility, were valued. They provided a connection to the outside world, a way to judge the weather and the time of day without opening the door and letting in the cold. The faint glow of dawn through the paper was a signal that the night was ending, that it was time to rise and begin the day. As settlers prospered and glass became more accessible, the oiled paper was replaced. Glass windows transformed the interior, flooding it with light and providing a clear view of the prairie. But for years, for many families, the oiled paper was all they had, and in the darkness of the dugout, light was not taken for granted. It was measured, conserved, valued. A single candle flame was enough to see by, enough to read a few verses from a Bible, enough to darn a sock or write a letter. And when the candle was extinguished, when the lamp was turned down, the darkness returned, total and complete, wrapping the household in a silence that was broken only by the crackle of the stove and the breathing of those who slept. The dugout was not a sealed environment. Its walls were organic, its roof was layered earth and grass, and its floor was packed soil. These materials supported life, but not only human life. The structure was a habitat, and other organisms shared it. Insects were the most persistent intruders. Fleas thrived in the straw bedding, in the cracks between sod blocks, and in the organic debris that accumulated in corners. They reproduced rapidly, each generation producing hundreds of offspring. Within weeks of filling a fresh straw tick, the bed would be infested. Flea bites were a constant irritation. They appeared as small red welts, usually on the ankles and lower legs where the insects had easy access. The bites itched intensely. Scratching led to secondary infections, particularly in children who could not resist the urge to scratch. There was no effective treatment. Families tried various remedies, washing bedding in lye soap, sprinkling ashes or sulphur powder, hanging bundles of herbs believed to repel insects, but none eliminated the problem entirely. The fleas persisted, a fact of life that had to be endured. Bedbugs were equally problematic. These insects hid in the seams of ticks, in the joints of bed frames, and in the cracks of walls. They emerged at night to feed on sleeping humans, biting exposed skin and then retreating to their hiding places. Bedbug bites were similar to flea bites, but often appeared in lines or clusters, following the path of a blood vessel beneath the skin. The bites were painless initially, but became itchy hours later. Like flea bites, they were prone to infection if scratched. Eliminating bedbugs was nearly impossible. The insects could survive for months without feeding, hiding in crevices and waiting. They were resistant to most household remedies. Some families resorted to dismantling their beds and scalding every piece with boiling water, a labour-intensive process that provided only temporary relief. Lice were another concern, particularly head lice and body lice. These parasites lived in hair and clothing, feeding on blood and causing intense itching. They spread easily in close quarters, moving from person to person during sleep or through shared clothing and bedding. Treating lice required vigilance. Hair had to be combed with fine-toothed combs to remove the insects and their eggs. Clothing and bedding had to be boiled. In severe cases, hair was cut short or shaved entirely, a drastic measure that was socially stigmatizing but effective. The presence of lice was not seen as a moral failing, but it carried social implications. A family known to be heavily infested might be avoided by neighbours. Children with lice might be excluded from school or community gatherings. The shame was real, even though the condition was common and difficult to prevent. Beyond insects, larger pests posed their own challenges. Mice and rats entered the dugout through gaps in the sod walls or around the doorframe. They nested in the roof, in stored grain, and in piles of clothing or bedding. Their presence was marked by droppings, gnawed materials, and the scratching sounds they made at night. Rodents were more than a nuisance. They consumed stored food, contaminating what they did not eat. They chewed through fabric, leather, and wood. They carried diseases that could be transmitted to humans through contact with their waste or through bites. Cats were the primary defense against rodents. A good mouser was a valuable asset, worth feeding and caring for despite the scarcity of resources. Some families kept multiple cats, allowing them to roam the interior freely in exchange for their hunting services. Traps were also used, simple wooden snap traps baited with grain or bacon fat. These were effective but limited in number. A family might own 2 or 3 traps, which could catch only a fraction of the rodent population. Snakes presented a different problem. Rattlesnakes, garter snakes, and bull snakes all found their way into the cool, dark spaces of the dugout. The sod walls, with their many small gaps and tunnels, were ideal habitat for snakes seeking shelter or hunting rodents. Rattlesnakes were the most dangerous. Their venom could kill a child and severely injure an adult. The snakes were not aggressive, but they would strike if stepped on or cornered. In the darkness of the dugout, it was easy to encounter a snake without seeing it. Families developed strategies to reduce snake intrusions. The walls were plastered with clay to seal gaps. The floor was swept regularly to remove debris that might attract rodents, which in turn attracted snakes. Boots and clothing were shaken out before being worn, as snakes sometimes sought warmth in fabric. Despite these precautions, snakes appeared regularly. Accounts described snakes dropping from the ceiling, coiled in corners, or discovered in bedding. The family's response was typically swift and violent. The snake was killed with a shovel or stick and removed from the dwelling. Not all snakes were killed. Bull snakes and garter snakes, being non-venomous and effective rodent predators, were sometimes tolerated. A family might allow a bull snake to remain in the rafters, recognizing that it would help control mice. This required a degree of comfort with living alongside reptiles that not everyone possessed. Spiders were ubiquitous. They spun webs in corners, across the ceiling, and in the gaps between sod blocks. Most were harmless, feeding on flies and other insects. A few species, such as black widows, were venomous and dangerous. Spider webs accumulated rapidly. They caught dust and debris, creating a dingy appearance. Families swept them down regularly, but new webs appeared within days. Some settlers gave up on removing them entirely, accepting the webs as part of the dugout's interior landscape. The presence of pests was exhausting. It was not simply the physical discomfort of bites and infestations, but the constant vigilance required to manage them. There was no moment of true cleanliness, no state in which the dwelling was free of unwanted life. To mitigate the psychological burden, some families reframed their relationship with the pests. They accepted them as inevitable, as part of the cost of living in an earth-sheltered structure. The pests were not invaders but co-inhabitants, sharing the space and tolerating each other's presence. This acceptance did not mean indifference. Families still fought against the pests, still tried to reduce their numbers and limit their impact, but they did so without the expectation of total victory. The goal was management, not elimination. The most visible response to the pest problem was the muslin ceiling. This was a sheet of fabric, often sewn together from flour sacks suspended from the roof beams a few feet below the actual ceiling. The fabric created a false ceiling that caught falling dirt, debris, and the occasional snake or insect. The muslin ceiling had to be taken down periodically and shaken out or washed. The accumulated material, dirt, dried grass, insect bodies, spider webs, was dumped outside. The process was unpleasant but necessary. The ceiling also reflected light, making the dim interior marginally brighter. White or light-coloured muslin bounced lamplight back into the room, creating a softer, more diffused illumination. This was a secondary benefit, but one that families appreciated. Despite all efforts, the pests persisted. They were part of the ecology of the dugout, sustained by the same materials and conditions that sustained the human occupants. The organic walls, the straw bedding, the stored food, all of these were resources for other forms of life. The pests were a reminder of the dugout's fundamental nature. It was not a house in the conventional sense separate from the environment. It was part of the environment, carved from it and remaining connected to it. The line between inside and outside was permeable, crossed constantly by organisms moving in search of shelter, food, and warmth. This permeability was both a weakness and a strength. It made the dugout difficult to keep clean and comfortable, but it also made the dugout functional, allowing it to moderate temperature and moisture through passive exchange with the surrounding earth. The war with pests was a war without end, fought daily through small actions, sweeping, shaking out bedding, checking corners, killing snakes, setting traps. It was a background task, like tending the fire or gathering chips, part of the routine of survival in an earth-sheltered dwelling. The interior surfaces of a dugout or sod house were rarely left bare. The exposed earth walls, while functional, were also sources of problems. They crumbled and shed particles. They absorbed moisture and released it unpredictably. They provided habitat for insects and rodents. To address these issues, many families finished their walls with plaster. This was not decorative work in the modern sense, but a practical intervention, a way to create a more stable and livable interior. The plaster was made from materials found locally. Alkali clay was common on the Great Plains, particularly in areas where seasonal ponds or playas formed. These shallow depressions collected rainwater and then dried out, leaving behind deposits of fine, sticky clay rich in mineral salts. The clay was collected and mixed with water to form a thick paste. The consistency had to be right. Too thin, and it would run off the walls. Too thick, and it would be difficult to spread. Some families added straw or animal hair to the mixture to improve its binding properties and reduce cracking as it dried. The plaster was applied by hand. The person doing the work would scoop up a handful of the paste and smear it onto the wall, smoothing it with their palms or with a flat piece of wood. The goal was to create a continuous layer that covered the earth and filled the gaps between sod blocks. The work was messy. The clay stuck to hands, clothing and tools. It dripped onto the floor. It required patience and repeated applications to build up a layer thick enough to be effective. Once applied, the plaster had to dry. This took several days, depending on the humidity and temperature. As it dried, the plaster hardened, forming a smooth, solid surface. The alkali in the clay gave it a slightly caustic quality, which helped repel insects. Fleas and bedbugs were less likely to burrow into plastered walls than into bare earth. The finished surface was pale grey or tan, depending on the colour of the original clay. It was not beautiful, but it was clean. It reflected lamplight better than bare earth, brightening the interior, and it created a psychological boundary, a sense that the walls were finished, that the dwelling was more than just a hole in the ground. Lime plaster was another option, though less common on the frontier due to the difficulty of obtaining lime. Lime had to be produced by burning limestone in a kiln, a process that required both the raw material and the knowledge of how to fire it correctly. For most homesteaders, this was beyond their means. Where lime was available, it was valued. Lime plaster was harder and more durable than clay plaster. It also had antimicrobial properties, reducing mould and mildew. A lime-plastered wall stayed cleaner and required less maintenance than a clay-plastered one. The plastering process was often a communal effort. Neighbours might gather to help a family finish their walls, turning the work into a social event. This was particularly common in sod house construction, where the scale of the project made assistance valuable. The plastered walls required maintenance. Cracks appeared as the structure settled or as the plaster dried unevenly. These cracks had to be filled, either with fresh plaster or with clay mixed on the spot. Left unrepaired, cracks became roots for insects and allowed dirt to fall from the wall. In addition to plaster, some families covered their walls with fabric or paper. This required a different approach. Wooden strips were attached to the sod, creating a framework. The fabric, muslin, flour sacks, old curtains, was then stretched over the framework and tacked in place. The fabric created a smooth, clean appearance. It could be whitewashed or papered over with newsprint or wallpaper, giving the interior a more refined look. For families who aspired to replicate the homes they had left behind, this finishing was important. It was a way of asserting that they were civilized, that they had not fully surrendered to the crudeness of frontier life. However, fabric walls had drawbacks. They created a cavity between the fabric and the sod, a space that attracted pests, mice, nested behind the fabric. Insects hid there. The fabric itself could tear or sag, requiring periodic replacement. Despite these issues, many families preferred fabric to bare earth. The visual and psychological benefits outweighed the practical complications. The fabric transformed the interior, making it feel less like a cave and more like a room. the floor too could be finished. While most dugouts and sod houses had packed earth floors, some families laid wooden planks when they could afford the lumber. A wooden floor was warmer underfoot than earth, easier to keep clean, and less prone to becoming muddy during wet weather. A plank floor required careful installation. The wood had to be elevated slightly above the earth to prevent rot. Joists were laid across the floor and planks were nailed to them. The gaps between planks were sometimes filled with rags or oakum to reduce drafts. Not all families could afford a wooden floor. For them, the earth floor was improved in other ways. It was covered with rugs or mats woven from grass or scraps of fabric. These coverings provided insulation and a softer surface, though they required frequent shaking out and cleaning. The process of finishing the interior was gradual. A family might plaster one wall and leave the others bare for months or years. They might install a wooden floor in stages, adding planks as lumber became available. The dwelling evolved over time, shaped by resources, labour, and the family's priorities. The finished interior, whether plastered or fabric-covered, created a sense of order. It was a human imposition on the raw earth, a statement that the dwelling was not merely shelter, but a home. The smoothness of the plaster, the whiteness of the muslin, the cleanliness of the floor, these were small victories against the harshness of the environment. But the improvements were always partial. No amount of plastering could eliminate the dampness entirely. No fabric covering could prevent dirt from falling during a windstorm. The dugout remained fundamentally what it was, a structure carved from the earth, subject to the same forces that shaped the landscape around it. The silence of the plastered walls was different from the silence of bare earth. Plaster absorbed sound, dampening echoes and creating a quieter interior. Conversations did not carry as far. Footsteps were softer. The space felt more enclosed, more private. This acoustic quality was subtle but noticeable. In a dwelling where privacy was minimal and sound travelled easily, the reduction in noise was a form of comfort. It allowed for quieter conversations, for moments that felt more intimate even in the shared space. The plaster also marked the seasons. In summer, when humidity was low, the plaster dried out and sometimes cracked. In winter, when the interior was humid from cooking and breathing, the plaster absorbed moisture and became slightly soft. These changes were minor but perceptible, a way the dwelling responded to the passage of time. For children, the plastered walls were a surface for interaction. They could be marked, scratched, drawn on. Some families allowed this, accepting the marks as part of the lived experience of the space. Others forbade it, insisting that the walls remain clean. The act of plastering itself became a skill passed down through generations. Children watched their parents mix clay, spread it, smooth it. They learned by observation, and eventually by doing, contributing to the maintenance of the dwelling as they grew. The plastered silence of the dugout was not absolute. The wind still whistled through gaps, the stove still crackled, the floor still creaked under footsteps, but the plaster softened these sounds, creating an interior that felt more controlled, more human, more home.